Well, hello, I'm Jason Renault with the Alternative Mobile Services Association. Today I'm with Jennifer Mathis of the Bazelon Institute. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Well, thanks for joining me. I wanted Jennifer to come and talk with us because she's an expert at all things disability law at Bazelon, and she's also had this recent experience with the Biden administration and the Department of Justice. So this will be an interesting conversation. But let's start with Jennifer. Would you tell us a little bit about you and about Bazelon?
Sure. I can start with the Bazelon Center. The Bazelon Center has been around for a little more than 50 years. We started in 1972 as the Mental Health Law Project and were eventually renamed after the judge, David Bazelon, who did a lot of wrote a lot of pioneering decisions in mental health law. And I have been here. Well, let me just say a little bit more first about what it does. We do both litigation as well as policy work. We have done a lot of big systemic cases. Some of the earlier cases were about things like civil commitment. The case some people may have heard of, O'Connor versus Donaldson, was an early case that was argued by the Bazelon Center. I think it was Bruce Ennis who did that, and that was about saying what due process rights meant for people in the civil commitment system, and that you had to have both a psychiatric disability and be dangerous, essentially, in
Hmm.
order to be civilly committed. And later on, I think we did a lot of work. Also, I should say all later on, even from the beginning, we have done work really building community service systems, mental health community service systems. And our focus has largely been ensuring that our service systems can serve people in their own homes and communities, trying to avoid needless institutionalization and incarceration, and giving people the services that they need on a daily basis to succeed, which is usually better for everybody and cheaper, and people have a much better quality of life. And it should be a win-win, and yet there's a lot of politics and other factors that get in the way of that. Um, we have also done some work in the last few years around this, increasingly around criminal justice systems and the intersection between mental health service systems and criminal justice, and particularly focused on preventing incarceration, and also trying to get a different response to mental health emergency calls instead of a law enforcement response, where appropriate, getting a crisis response instead. So that's a little bit about the Bazelon Center. That's some of the litigation that we've done. We do policy work in Congress, also in administrative agencies. We do public education, technical assistance. We are very involved with Medicaid as well. Certainly, the Medicaid fight that is happening right now, we are spending a lot of time on. Medicaid is certainly the backbone of our community mental health service systems, and critically important. I have been at the Bazelon Center for a long time, with a couple of interruptions. I began in January of 1999, and I have been here since then, with a stint at the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity
Hmm.
Commission, during the Obama administration, where I went in part to go help write the regulations under the ADA Amendments Act, because I had been on the team that helped negotiate that with the business community and the disability community, sitting at a table and negotiating that. And then during the Biden administration, I served as a political appointee in the Justice Department Civil Rights Division, as a Deputy Assistant Attorney General. And so, um, at the Justice Department, we were doing a lot of work on um, Olmstead, community integration, many issues related to all kinds of disability rights, but I think at the forefront of those were the Olmstead cases and also the cases around emergency response and
Mm.
alternative response.
Well, that's what we're keenly interested in. There's several of the mobile crisis teams around the country have been created through these consent decrees between DOJ and various city police departments. Um, what's the status of those at this point?
So right now, there are two proposed consent decrees that were negotiated between DOJ and municipalities and police departments. One of those is in Louisville, and one of those is in Minneapolis. Those were two of the big policing investigations and findings that had come out of the Justice Department, really on the heels of the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. That's why those jurisdictions were under scrutiny. Um, I think those consent decrees are both very significant. Obviously, they were both much bigger than the disability piece.
Mm.
Disability ADA claims were a piece of both of those consent decrees, and that was the first time that DOJ had an ADA claim like that that was the subject of a consent decree. The broader consent decrees much more about police practices. Some of it being about police practices with respect to how, when the police do actually respond to a mental health call, how should they modify their response? But most of it is about a lot of other police practices, unconstitutional policing issues, how police interact with people generally, the types of techniques that they use, and safer practices, and looking at discriminatory practices, including race discrimination and treatment of children, and all kinds of other issues. To me, I think many of those other police practices and claims around the police practices are something that we've seen for many years,
Mm.
right? There's a lot of there's a long tradition at the Justice Department and elsewhere of kind of looking at police practices and raising constitutional claims, statutory claims around some of those, because there have been some concerns over the years about those practices. But this issue of really looking at whether the police are the right responder in the first place
Mm.
when somebody is the subject of an emergency call, who has a mental health or substance use disability, behavioral health disability. Um, that is new. And so that really was an evolution of the law, and people really thinking about it. And we started to think about it at the Bazelon Center in a different way,
Mm.
really after the murder of George Floyd and others. I think we really began thinking about how you could avoid police response in the first place, rather than focusing on, just how to change police response when police do respond. Or, before we had also focused on, I think, preventing people from getting to a jailhouse door, diverting people from incarceration, looking at our community integration work also from a lens of intersection with the criminal justice system. So some of our work had been around trying to prevent unnecessary incarceration by developing the same community services that would prevent people from being hospitalized. It's the same services that prevent people from being incarcerated inappropriately, unnecessarily, all of that. So We had brought some Olmsted litigation, including in Alameda County, that was about people cycling, so people who were largely homeless and cycling between the street, the shelter, the emergency room, the psych hospital, the jail. And so we have a settlement. The Justice Department's involved in that as well with Alameda County that had it had been a case about Olmsted claims, a case bringing Olmsted claims, seeking the community services that people needed so that they weren't constantly at risk of needless institutionalization in a psychiatric hospital. We also raised the fact that people were going to jail as well as a result of the lack of those services, and particularly for people who were Black in Alameda County, the data was quite striking that people who were Black were incarcerated at much higher rates when they were picked up by police as a result of a mental health issue, and were also hospitalized more. And so, those were some of the issues that we had been focusing on before. But in the most recent years, we started to focus too on this issue of how can we prevent a situation where people are constantly being responded to by the police when the police are not the right responder. And when, if somebody had called 911 because of a different type of health emergency, a medical emergency, a heart attack, a stroke, that of course we would never send a police officer. So we started to think about that from a discrimination lens and started to think about how to use the ADA. That is the thing about laws like the ADA is it's a very broad law, and it was deliberately, broad. Civil rights laws typically are because they're designed to apply to many different situations, which you're not going to be able to anticipate. And so, I think the genius of civil rights laws in a way is, or maybe it's not genius, but it's the practicality of them
Right.
is that they will always apply in new situations that people hadn't thought about before. And so, this is one. And so we are starting to see the development of the law. So DOJ had also had a few other sets of findings. They had findings in Memphis
Yep.
as part of a broader policing investigation. And I thought the findings in Memphis were pretty interesting, in part because there, I think the police were sent even when it was in response to a physical health emergency, if they learned that the person had a mental
Oh,
health disability.
right.
And so that was Memphis. And then there was Oklahoma City.
Yep.
And then there was one
Phoenix.
more that I'm blanking at, Phoenix. And so you had all of those. I think Oklahoma City happened very late in the Biden administration. Those findings came out very, very late. And so that was not filed as a consent decree, nor was Phoenix. I think because Phoenix
Hmm.
actually was not interested so much in negotiating.
No.
And let's see. And so Phoenix, Oklahoma City, and Memphis. Memphis also, I think the findings were fairly late on. And so um, with those other three, you didn't have anything that was negotiated fully. And so it remains to be seen what the new administration is going to
Okay.
do in those cases. It also remains to be seen what is going to happen with the proposed consent decrees that were filed with the courts in Louisville and in Minneapolis, because the courts have not signed them yet, have not approved them. So we don't know what the new administration is going to do, but they may well say to the courts that they are no longer interested in pursuing them.
And
And we'll
and
see.
for the cities where there's a case already underway, maybe underway for several years, Are those consent decrees, are they in any jeopardy at this point?
Um, I don't think there's any current litigation by the Justice Department, but there's litigation that's underway by private parties, right? So in Oregon, for example, Disability Rights Oregon has a case that is pending on this
Mhm.
issue.
Washington
And
County versus DRO, right?
exactly, exactly. And they have a very good decision that they just got from the judge. They'd had a good decision from the magistrate, and the judge just reaffirmed it.
Hmm.
And so, that case is moving forward. And then there's the ACLU's case in DC, this Bread for the City case as well. And they also have a good preliminary ruling in their favor. So, we're starting to see some of the law um, solidify in this area. And I don't think that the Justice Department's work will ultimately, if they do decide not to continue in Louisville and Minneapolis, I don't think that is going to have an impact on these ongoing cases. The
Hmm.
Justice Department had come in Bread for the City and had filed a brief in support of the plaintiffs in Bread for the City. Um, or actually in support of the many of the legal positions that the plaintiffs had. But it depends how the Justice Department does it and what it says. But I suspect that if they do decide not to pursue it, that they will simply say we're not pursuing it. And so I don't think that that will have an impact on the cases that are currently pending.
So just backing out versus denouncing it and saying this is not a
Exactly.
legal process.
Exactly.
Well, that leaves it in a safe position for future litigation.
Yeah. Yeah. So it really depends what they say.
And so you were
But
mentioning that before we got on here that Louisville is coming right up.
that's right. The Justice Department had asked for a couple of extensions. The judge had asked a number of questions, um, largely about other issues besides the ADA issue. The judge did ask a little bit about the ADA issue and how it would work and how you would tell when an emergency call was a mental health related call. And so the Justice Department was supposed to answer those questions. And I know that there were some amicus groups, including the Bazelon Center. Because I'm recused from that now because of
Right.
my Justice Department involvement in that. I wasn't part of the filing that happened from here, but I know there were some mental health experts and advocates and others who filed a brief and answered some of those questions also for amici in that case. But the Justice Department asked for a couple of extensions, and I think it is coming up in a few days, the deadline for them to respond. And so we'll see what they do.
I think we talked to ACLU Kentucky about that a few months ago and helping them get ready for that brief. So
Right.
it sounds like there's still some play that's going to happen here over the next weeks or months to decide whether these current consent decrees continue or not. What do you see
Yeah.
the fate of alternative mobile services being in SAMHSA or other parts of the federal government at this point? Are you able to read the tea leaves?
Well, I do worry a little bit. I think it is certainly a very helpful development that we have seen a lot more interest in the last several years in developing alternative response programs. And so there are many more of them than there were not that long ago, which I think is an important foundation going forward. Certainly, there have always been mobile crisis teams for a long time, but they haven't been integrated with the 911 system. So they haven't been used in the same way
Hmm.
to divert a police response where appropriate. And so that's a newer development. Of course, we for many years had the Cahoots program out of Eugene, Oregon, and it is pretty concerning that Cahoots just shut down. You are probably more familiar than I with the what happened there with the financing. I know that in some places there was COVID money that was funding some
That's right.
crisis services, and there, I think some of that money was about to end regardless, but the federal government yanked it prematurely, and it's a significant amount of money in a lot of states, and so I know there's litigation around that, and I don't know if the Cahoots development was related to that money or something else.
That was part of it. There were other
Okay.
factors.
Okay. So, I mean, that's concerning, obviously, what happened in Eugene and Cahoots is being the oldest program like this, it was not a great development. I hope it will be back at some point, um, but I do think that there is a significant foundation now in across the country for those programs and a significant amount of interest in those programs, and you will see continued litigation using the ADA to try to address the problem of why we send a law enforcement response to mental health emergencies when we send a very different health-led response to all other health emergencies. And so I am optimistic about that. I do think that we are in a challenging environment. You mentioned the federal government, and obviously now we are looking at a reorganization in HHS and the Federal Department of Health and Human Services. That is impacting a lot of relevant components of HHS. Certainly SAMHSA and the Administration on Community Living. I think particularly for mental health, SAMHSA has been very important in a number of ways. And one of those ways is really being the guide for state mental health service systems and what the building blocks of a community mental health system
Yeah.
should look like. And Medicaid is the main payer of those services, but SAMHSA really drives what they look like. And I have seen over and over again states really gravitating towards the mental health service system of 50 years ago and doing a lot of old school segregated services, without proven effectiveness, and SAMHSA has played this really key role in putting out information to states. They do these toolkits, and toolkits don't always sound like a thing that's that serious. But I mean, with SAMHSA, they really have been key. They've been very, very helpful in laying out what the evidence is, what the proven success is for different key services, how to build a program in a state. And they have these toolkits, guidance, guidelines for supported housing, for assertive community treatment, for mobile crisis services. They don't have a toolkit for mobile crisis. They were starting to develop one now. But they have national crisis guidelines that tell you a lot about what mobile crisis services should look like and other crisis services, peer support services, supported employment services. And I think without SAMHSA playing that role, state mental health service systems would look very different. And they really have been so important. And so I don't know what's going to happen when SAMHSA is folded into this administration for a healthy America that is going to be created out of SAMHSA and a number of other agencies, SAMHSA, HRSA, NIOSH,
Right.
OASH, and agencies that seem not that relevant in some cases in their mission to SAMHSA. But we know that the history is that SAMHSA was separated from NIMH originally to really have an agency clearly focused on guiding community services. And that was so important. And so now to mush it in with a bunch of other agencies with less clearly related missions seems problematic. And, it's also concerning that at SAMHSA, within SAMHSA, the pieces of SAMHSA that have been cut include virtually all the leadership of the Center for Mental Health Services, including the Community Support Services branch that does all that guidance on community services, and other parts that were very, very important. The part that does the NISDA survey, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, that I
Mm.
think is used used by states and localities and others in many ways. And so all of those pieces may go, I don't, I mean, they shouldn't go away. I think they can't go away. Congress has provided for them. Congress has provided a bunch of statutory responsibilities specifically for the director of the Center for Mental Health Services. Right now, that director has been riffed and there is nobody serving in that role. It is unclear what will happen. We are advocating certainly for HHS to ensure that whatever it does with this reorganization, that those functions are preserved. And the functions that Congress talked about and the functions of serving as the guide and the communicator of those core successful community-based services, and also doing the NISDA survey and generally being, I think, the driver of
Mm.
what good thinking is in community-based service systems.
I would note that the draft of the Mobile Crisis Toolkit by SAMHSA has been removed from
Yes.
the website. Do you foresee, I guess this is my last question, do you foresee litigation being from private organizations here representing the interests of the end user being a factor here?
Well, that's a good question. I think certainly people are looking at it. Um, I think we need to be able to show, to have successful litigation, usually what the impact is, what the harms are, right? And I think right now, people are trying to figure that out. I think it's in a little bit of flux right now. And,
Mhm.
you have to be able to be in a position to say, because of what you have just done, this is going to happen. And I think when you're at the point when you can show that and say that, I think then,
Yeah.
there is a good case to be had. And I think people are trying to figure that out
So we
right
can't
now.
really show that by, say, the riffing of the executives from SAMHSA, that's a harm to the public.
Well, I mean, it is, but I think right
Mm.
now, I think for one thing, there's some focus on what are the immediate harms that you can point to. For example, I was interested in whether 988 funding was getting
Mm.
out, which it
Right.
does seem to be, and whether crisis services funding is getting out. Of course, there is the litigation that's separate around that COVID money that was going for crisis services and other things. There already is litigation on that. But
Mm.
things that would be sort of these immediate harms, as opposed to just saying, well, there's 17 statutory responsibilities, and right now, at this moment in time,
Mhm.
you don't have the person. I think it's very easy for them to come and say, well, we're about to do that. We're in
Right.
flux and in another, give us 2 weeks and, whatever. And so I think that it really depends on the showing that you can make. And at this point, I think I'll just say people are trying to figure it out.
It's just it hasn't even been 100 days yet.
No, everything is moving very, very rapidly, and I guess that's deliberate. And it really um, feels terrifying. It feels like there's so many just unknowable harms and knowable harms too. And it's pretty dramatic. I think obviously Medicaid is an enormous part of that picture, and we have a joint budget resolution that still says the
Yeah.
House is supposed to cut $880 billion from a certain area, an energy and commerce jurisdiction, much of which would have to come from the Medicaid program. And we will see what happens there. That doesn't seem to be quite the same appetite in the Senate for that. However, they did do this joint budget resolution, and we all have to keep fighting right now. It is just so urgent at this point in time that people let their members of Congress know right now they're at home for 2 weeks, but then they will be back. Um, that we cannot have cuts to Medicaid. We can't have these kinds of dramatic cuts because it will decimate mental health services. Medicaid is the funder of public mental health service systems, and we cannot afford to lose that money. And the first things cut are optional services that will include a lot of community mental health services. The irony is it will be more expensive to serve many people. Many people will end up institutionalized or incarcerated. People will cycle, again, as we discussed,
Very
between
expensive.
jails and hospitals and ERs. That is expensive too. It is often as expensive to have somebody be homeless as it is to support them in supported housing with rental subsidy and services. And so the irony is, I think that money will not be saved in the end, but it may fall on the backs of states and local governments if the federal government um, does not fund it through Medicaid or through its share of Medicaid. So that is urgent. I think we will see work requirements put on the table as a potential way to cut Medicaid. And work requirements often will have an exception for people with disabilities. Those exceptions have not worked to keep
Oh,
people with disabilities from losing their health coverage inappropriately due to
yeah.
work requirements. Also, they tend not to apply to people who come in the Medicaid expansion. There's a lot of people with mental health disabilities who come in through the expansion. Just because they didn't get eligible or they didn't apply through a disability pathway for Medicaid doesn't mean they don't have a disability. I'm not suggesting that people with disabilities can't work. That is not the issue. But what is the issue is the work requirements just end up functioning as essentially a bureaucratic nightmare for people. And we know from past experience from all of the states that imposed Medicaid work requirements during the first Trump administration that the overwhelming majority of people who lost coverage were not people who were supposed to lose coverage. They were people who were supposed to be exempt or they already were working. And the majority of people on Medicaid already are working. But so that they were not serving to actually increase employment and they did nothing to increase employment, but people lost their coverage instead because they didn't understand the reporting requirements or they didn't understand that they were supposed to continue to report
Mm,
or they didn't have access to a
right.
computer or any number of things
Problems.
like that.
Problems. Oh my. Jennifer, this is really horrendous what you're telling us. We're just at the precipice here and about to go over the edge. And it's just a great to hear from you this expert snapshot of the legal details and the sausage making of policy that's going on here. Thanks for your work.
Absolutely, absolutely. And please, to the extent that anybody is watching this when this Medicaid battle is still happening, please do contact your members of Congress and tell them how important Medicaid is. There are a lot of members of Congress who one might not peg as big Medicaid supporters, but in fact have become uh, uh, enamored of Medicaid in new ways because they now have lots of constituents who are on Medicaid, and
Mhm.
um, there are a lot of you know, Medicaid is a much more popular program than it used to be. I think there's a lot of room to advocate with non-traditional people and members of Congress who you might not have pegged, might have voted against the Affordable Care Act, but who actually have a lot of angst or concern about voting to cut Medicaid. And so there really is room there for people to advocate.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you.